The legendary city of Troy was one of the most significant factors of the Bronze Age Aegean and Western Anatolia. Famed for its high walls and wealth, it was best known for its role in the Trojan War, where it was eventually destroyed by the Achaeans and burned down to the ground. But before this legendary war, the city stood tall and proud for almost 2,000 years. In this episode, we bring to light the history of Troy before the Trojan War. The history of Troy started long before the Trojan War. The city was located in northwestern Anatolia, just south of the mouth of Dardanelles. The name of the city itself was Ilion or Ilias, in Hittite rendering known as Wilusa. This was equivalent to Wilion, an earlier Greek pronunciation of the Bronze Age. The term Troia reflected both the city and the immediate area it controlled, together with its inhabitants, the Trojans. The city of Ilion was founded sometime around 3000 BCE as a merchant city and quickly became an important trading post in the region of Troad. As the Trojans did not leave any written records behind, it is difficult to determine the names of many of their rulers, their political history, or even their language. While it is apparent that the Trojans could speak and understand the Greek language of the time, another theory about a possible Luwian language also exists among the scholars. The only archaeological evidence found on the site was a Hittite seal with a Luwian inscription from the 13th century BCE. However, the seal was likely an externally made object brought to Troy, and considering that the Luwian language was the lingua franca of the Hittite Empire of the time, it is no surprise that Luwian was at least familiar at Ilion. On the other hand, according to the Iliad, Trojans and Achaeans appeared to share the same customs, culture, and language. On the contrary, the Trojans did not speak the same language as some of their own allies, notably those belonging to the Luwic group. Furthermore, according to a treaty of the early 13th century BCE between the Hittites and the city of Wilusa, the ruler of Ilion appears to be of Greek origin, named Alexandru, or in Greek, Alexander. Among the gods guaranteeing the terms of the signed treaty, the Hittites recorded that the protector of the Trojans was Apollonius, the Hittite rendering of god Apollo. This indicates that Greek culture and language were present at Troy, at the very least on the royal court during the late Bronze Age. The Luwian features also seemed to have been present, leading to a possibility of relation to both cultures. According to Greek mythology, the whole area was once ruled from Dardanos, founded by its eponymous ruler of the same name. King Dardanos was originally a noble from Arcadia in Peloponnese, and upon arriving to the region, he married Bateia, the only child of King Teucer or Teucros, who himself was originally a colonist from Crete. Dardanos was allowed to found his own city, which, as mentioned, he named after himself. Upon the death of Teucer, the new king incorporated the whole area in his realm and reigned from Dardanos as his capital. He was succeeded by Elos, who despite having a long reign, died childless and was in turn succeeded by his brother Erichthonius. Erichthonius was said to have enjoyed a peaceful reign, after which he was succeeded by his son Tros. The land was therefore named after Tros, and the whole region was from then on called Troad, and its inhabitants the Trojans. King Tros was succeeded by his son Elos II, who eventually decided to move the capital from Dardanos and found a new city to serve as his royal seat. The new city was inhabited by the Trojans of Mount Ida, city of Dardanos and the surrounding areas, and was named Ilion, the very site of the legendary Troy. The city of Troy quickly established itself as the main settlement of the area, obtaining control of the Dardanelles and heavily profiting from the sea trade connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. It was centered around a small citadel protected with walls and towers, more than enough to keep the city protected during the early 3rd millennium BCE. The city was significantly expanded in the following centuries, and by 2500 BCE, Ilion was doubled in size, with a lower town being developed around the upper citadel. The citadel was protected with high walls and contained a Megaron-style palace for the king. Around 2200 BCE, the city of Troy was attacked by the invaders. The war did not seem to be successful on the part of the Trojans, and the city was burned down by a large fire. As we have no historical records for this time period, it is difficult to assess what really took place. The Achaeans were only founding their settlements and communities throughout the mainland Greece at this period, and were not yet developed enough to distinguish themselves from the pre-Greek and proto-Greek tribes that already existed there. The Minoan civilization of Crete was on the rise and expanding throughout the Aegean, but it was a trade-based thalassocracy and the writing systems were yet to be developed. The first solid evidence of Luwians also appears only later, and there is no certain records of other Anatolian inhabitants of the time, leaving us to guess who the attackers really were. Either way, after the sack of the city at about 2200 BCE, Ilion quickly recovered and its citadel was rebuilt to an even larger scale than before. The walls were enlarged as well, but still this period seems to have been the time of stagnation rather than expansion. As the Anatolian migrations were taking place towards the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, only the well-protected cities and kingdoms were able to withstand the subsequent crises. Although the residential areas of Troy do not seem to have prospered, the high walls of Ilion withstood the test of time. Subsequently, the trade was expanded and increased with many of the neighboring cities and islands, many of which were colonies established by the expanding Cretans, who had in the meantime managed to become a leading power of the Aegean Sea. Over the next centuries, the Trojans continued to strengthen their walls, probably signifying a potential threat by the new states and kingdoms developing as the result of migrations. The new millennium saw the influence of Crete stronger than ever, with the Minoan civilization reaching its heyday. This subsequently enriched many of the coastal cities that depended on the sea trade. The city of Troy was now able to continue to prosper and expanded its influence over the neighboring cities and towns. However, the following centuries saw change of the existing order among the Achaean and Anatolian powers. In Anatolia, the long tradition of smaller independent cities and kingdoms was finally put to an end. As the original Hattian people saw the demise of their kingdom centered around the city of Hattusa, another people, the speakers of the neighboring Nesete language and the successors of a king named Anita, seized the opportunity and conquered the whole region. These people subsequently started calling themselves the Hatti in respect to the old Hattians they had absorbed. But to history, these people became known as the Hittites, establishing themselves as the first great power of Anatolia. In the Aegean, the Minoan civilization suffered a series of devastating events. First, a Thera volcanic eruption that crippled its trade dominance, then an earthquake of the mid-15th century BCE that devastated the palace centers across the island. Subsequently, the Achaeans of the mainland Greece were able to seize the opportunity and establish their own influence over the Aegean and eventually conquered the declining civilization of Crete. The 15th century BCE saw an increasing threat from both sides as the Achaeans were expanding to the west and Hittites to the east of Ilion and its neighbors. The kingdoms of western Anatolia quickly realized that only united they could be able to battle the danger coming from the newly developed powers. The city of Ilion entered a broad confederation of the western Anatolian kingdoms called Asuwa. Asuwa consisted of 22 Anatolian cities and was likely centered around the land of Asuwa, which held a special sway among the western Anatolians and whose king was later credited as being the overlord of the whole confederation. As the Achaeans established their foothold in Anatolia through the coastal city of Miletus and subsequently focused on trade with Anatolians as opposed to the conquest preferred by the Hittites, the Asuwa League quickly turned to the Achaean king for support against the imminent war with Hatti. The marriage between the Achaean king and the daughter of the Asuwan king was arranged to strengthen the relations with the Asuans, even giving away the Aegean islands they had in possession to the Achaeans in exchange for support. However, none of these maneuvers would ultimately give result as the Hittite king Tudhalia marched against the confederation and utterly destroyed the forces of the Asuwa League. Although subjugating many of the defeated kingdoms, Tudhalia did not proceed to Velusa and the city of Ilion remained unconquered. The following time period saw change in the politics of the Trojans. While the neighboring Asuwa continued to wage wars on the Hittites and to rely on the Achaean support, Troy adopted a more benevolent strategy, keeping friendly relations with the Hatti, but also avoiding to provoke the Achaeans and their Anatolian allies. Such maneuvering between the neighboring powers allowed the Trojans to further prosper and gain wealth, while using masterful diplomacy to avoid armed conflict. This situation would continue until the late 14th century BCE, when the kingdom of Asuwa was finally conquered by the Hittites and dissolved for good. Prior to these events, a Trojan ruler was recorded by the Hittite sources, written as Kukuni, the king of Velusa, in the Hittite rendering. After Asuwa was conquered, the Hittite power in western Anatolia was greater than ever, and subsequently all of the neighboring rulers were more or less made vassals and clients of the Hatti. Among them was Alexander of Ilion, the ruler of Troy in the early 13th century BCE, to the Hittite sources known as Alexandru of Velusa. 2 treaties were made with the Hittites, in which Alexander was placed under the Hittite hegemony, but also protection against apparent enemies to his claim to the Trojan throne. As the Achaeans were obviously unhappy with the increased Hittite influence, the answer was soon coming in the form of military action. It is unclear if Alexander's reign ended peacefully or not, as he was approaching old age at the time of the Hittite treaties anyway, but his apparent successor, a pro-Hittite candidate named Walmu, was no longer able to escape military conflict. The Achaeans sponsored series of anti-Hittite insurrections throughout western Anatolia, especially in the territory of former Asuwa, and it wasn't long until the Mycenaean expedition was launched towards the city of Troy. Ilion was subsequently sacked by the Greeks as a part of a brief Achaean-Hittite war that broke out between the two powers. As the Greeks and Hittites apparently reached a peace agreement, Troy was left alone for the time being. This earlier, lesser-known sack of Troy was known to the ancient Greeks as an expedition carried out by Heracles against the Trojan king Laomedon, variously described as a son or a descendant of a mythical founder Ilos. In this war, Laomedon and most of his sons were killed, except for Podarches, who was spared by the great Achaean hero. Years later, this Podarches would re-emerge in the city of Ilion, eventually becoming himself the city's ruler. This Podarches would also become known under a different name, none other than Priam, the king of Troy. And thus lasted the nearly 2 millennia long history of the great city of Ilion, before what was to Trojans the most tragical and devastating event, but to the Greeks the most celebrated military conflict of all, the Trojan War. Please consider subscribing and sharing the video, as this is a one-person production and it greatly helps the visibility of the channel. Special thanks to History with Sai, Nico and the State Care for their continuous support. If you wish to become a Patreon member, feel free to click the link in the video description. This was WanaxTV and we'll see you again soon.